Good afternoon and welcome everyone. My name is Lola Cullen and I'm the Alumni Relations Officer for UCD Sutherland School of Law. I'm delighted to welcome you to this afternoon's episode of our UCD in Conversation. This episode is hosted by the UCD Alumni Relations Office in conjunction with the UCD Centre for Human Rights. Through this series, we welcome our alumni community and friends from around the world to listen to fellow alumni, UCD academics, and guests as they share their stories and ideas. The series also reflects UCD's Rising to the Future strategy and its 4 strategic themes: creating a sustainable global society, transforming through digital technology, building a healthy world, and empowering humanity. I'm delighted to welcome our expert speakers today. Firstly, Dr. Liam Thornton from the UCD Sutherland School of Law, who is our host for today's event. He will be joined by UCD alumni panelists Sinéad Gibney, Sally Hayden, Bulelani, Mfaco, and Jack Pope. This event's format will be roughly a 50-minute conversation between our panelists with questions from the audience being answered throughout the discussion. So please feel free to submit your questions during the conversation using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And Liam will get to as many as he can, but unfortunately he may not have time to address them all. We will share any website links mentioned during today's event in the chat channel. And with that, it is my pleasure to now hand you over to Liam.
Thank you so much, Lola, and welcome everybody to today's UCD in Conversation event hosted by UCD Alumni Office in conjunction with the UCD Centre for Human Rights. I'm Liam Thornton, and we're joined today by our expert panel, Sinéad Gibney, Chief Commissioner of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission; Sally Hayden, award-winning journalist who recently published her book, My Fourth Time We Drowned; Bulelani Mfaco, PhD candidate in TU Dublin and activist on rights for persons seeking protection in Ireland; Jack Pope, Associate Human Rights Officer in the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Now, as Lola mentioned, throughout, we are going to put your questions, your thoughts, your analysis to the panelists in so much as we can. I'd ask you, as I'll be engaging with the Q&A function, that you keep questions in the Q&A function, as I won't be accessing the chat panel, I'm afraid. As I speak, we are witnessing a significant movement of persons in Europe, something that eclipses the early 1990s in the Yugoslav or homeland wars. Today, Ukrainians and persons living in Ukraine are fleeing the aggression of the Russian Federation's illegal war. But before coming to our panel, I think it's important that I just introduce some core concepts. The title of today's series, Borders and Rights, Migrants' Journeys. That word migrant, there's a difference between how, at least in law, we use different labels. We use labels such as asylum seeker, labels such as refugee, and labels such as migrant. Our societal understanding of those concepts, which we'll often use interchangeably to mean several different things. These interchangeable labels often and always have a more precise and exacting legal meaning. An asylum seeker is a person who arrives in a country and seeks to have their claim for refugee or other protection status determined by the country they have arrived in. A refugee is a person who has met requisite legal proofs and evidenced that they have a well-founded fear of persecution, where that persecution is due to their race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, and/or their political opinion. Other aspects of protection are also potentially available. The phrase migrant, then, is an all-encompassing description, a person who moves from their country of birth or country of former habitual residence to a country that they do not have citizenship of, A person who is a migrant, as well as including persons who are asylum seekers and refugees, also encompasses persons who have permission to be in a country to undertake work, family, caring responsibilities, but also very importantly includes persons who do not have a legal permission to be in a country and who may be a migrant with undocumented status. All migrants have rights, regardless of the legal labeling that law attempts to place upon people. So over the next 15 minutes or so, we want to explore with our expert panel just some pressing issues that relate to migrant journeys. This may include examining the journey of migrants, the role of borders, which impacts so significantly on the rights of at least certain migrants and impacts hugely on persons fleeing persecution. From freedom of all European Union citizens to work in another EU member state, to persons crossing deserts, to persons navigating restrictive borders, undergoing rights violations in countries of transit and in countries of arrival. For migrants and refugees who can travel to another country by air, road and sea with relative ease, to those migrants and refugees who feel the full force of Fortress Europe. And Sally Hayden, in your book, published just this week, My Fourth Time We've Drowned, you document migrant journeys. It's an extraordinarily difficult read. What, based in your analysis, Sally, do you see as the core challenge for migrants seeking to enter Europe from the African continent?
I mean, yeah, like it's a good question, because I guess the initial challenge is just that there aren't legal routes. Like the legal routes aren't available to the vast majority of people. And so it, of course, like you've said, depends how you're trying to access a different country. But like, for example, you know, we speak about this difference between maybe people who are fleeing something and people who are looking for opportunities. I mean, both of those don't exist to the extent that that they could. And so people who are seeking safety, you know, who would be deemed as refugees, basically, if they could get into a territory where they could make that claim, and the number or the amount of spaces for refugee resettlement, for example, are very, very minuscule compared to the level of need. And so that isn't an option for most people. And even when it is, there's a lot of irregularities with that process, which mean that it's not available to a lot of people who need it. And then, yeah, if you talk more about migrants, people who wouldn't necessarily qualify for refugee status, again, you don't have opportunities to travel in terms of, you know, job opportunities, scholarships, education opportunities, all of this. And so, yeah, we live in an incredibly unequal world. So that basically means that depending on where you're born, you have an extreme level of privilege where you can travel pretty much anywhere, or you can travel nowhere. And then you see people embarking on, you know, what's called irregular migration, or through routes that are incredibly dangerous, trying to reach a place where they can then become one of those people who will have those rights in the future. And then that's where you encounter a whole host of other problems, which are based on the increased securitization of borders. And that's just been growing and growing. And so my book specifically looks at what is happening in the central Mediterranean, which is the route from North Africa, so generally from Libya to Italy or Malta. And what has been happening there since 2017 is that the EU has been supporting the Libyan Coast Guard in what is effectively a circumnavigation of international law. So if you have European vessels, they cannot intercept boats of people, be they refugees or migrants or asylum seekers, you know, whatever their legal classification, they cannot intercept them and return them to a place where their life is in danger, which Libya is a war-torn militia run country where, you know, there isn't a rule of law, people's lives are in danger. But if a Libyan vessel intercepts them, they can return them. So we have a situation where the EU is conducting surveillance. They're flying drones, helicopters, planes to spot refugee boats in the central Mediterranean. But then the Libyan Coast Guard is being empowered to do interceptions and bring people back to Libya, where they're forced into indefinite detention. And since 2017, roughly 90,000 men, women, and children have been intercepted like this, trying to reach Europe and forced back into centres that Pope Francis, among others, has compared to concentration camps. And so, yeah, I don't know that many Europeans realize that this is a direct result of European policy, that these people are being locked up in centres where there's torture, rape, starvation, everything bad that you can imagine.
So that issue of securitization and European Union, who continuously drones on about the rule of law, yet seeks to undermine it at every possible stage of the migrant journey. And Bulelani, we've been kind of just contrasting Sally's analysis from her book. We've seen on our screens over the last 2 months, played out in real time, how Europe can respond to refugee-like movements due now due to the illegal war in Ukraine. That's a stark contrast to that picture that Sally provides of securitization and rights violation. Do you have any thoughts on that, Bulelani?
It is, because if you start to think about the measures that Sally mentioned, that the EU has gone through to deter people from approaching EU frontiers or EU borders, such as drones, such as they were talking about floating fences in the ocean. They were also talking about sound systems that will be able to make it unbearable for a migrant to approach an EU border if turned on. And so there's quite a lot of investment coming from the EU into deterring people from approaching EU borders, and even going as far as paying Turkey and Libya to keep people from reaching EU borders. You saw countries such as Hungary, Austria being very hostile towards migrants, but that flipped as soon as Putin invaded Ukraine. We saw a very different approach altogether, even in Ireland, when it comes to receiving people who were fleeing the war, who are still fleeing the war. We saw the EU, for instance, invoking the Temporary Protection Directive for the very first time ever. It's never been invoked. It was never invoked for the war in Yemen, the war in Iraq, the war in Syria, Afghanistan. You can name Ethiopia. You can name any war. It was never invoked, even though there was a mass movement of people towards the EU. And so that's one of the reasons that they invoke it. It's that mass movement of people who moved towards the EU. That was met with deterrence when it was migrants from Middle Eastern, Asian, and Africa. But of course, the Taoiseach, the Deputy Prime Minister in Ireland, explained it to us very beautifully. He didn't mince his words. He said, "They are Europeans. So we will do differently because they are Europeans." So all the things that we've been asking the Irish state to do and the European Union to do for refugees, asylum seekers coming into the European Union, they've been done very quickly for people from Ukraine. It was very easy for the Irish state to open a welcome center at the airport to ensure that people are issued with PPS cards, with PPS numbers on arrival. People are getting a decision within days. Whereas you have people who are stuck in hotels across Ireland who arrived here in November, in October, in December last year, who don't have a temporary residency card that will allow them to get a PPS card, to get a medical card, to apply for the weekly allowance, to get their children into schools. And then you read on the newspapers that a Ukrainian child has started school 5 days from arrival in the country because the Irish state has done all that it can to ensure that that child has access to all the documentation they need in order to be able to go to school. But all those measures have never been employed for the reception of other people who have fled war and persecution from other parts of the world. And that is disgraceful that we are observing that in the year 2022. So there's a very big difference in how the EU states are responding to the situation in Ukraine and to other people who are on the move.
And I think, Bulelani, we might come back to some of kind of the key points you've made as regards kind of reception and rights of persons seeking protection in Ireland. But Bulelani and Sally have noted kind of the broad architecture. We've mentioned the European Union, also Ireland and Ireland's application of European Union law. And Sinéad Gibney, I'm going to come to you. And is there even a role for a small country like Ireland to challenge the Western approaches, I think it's fair to call it Western approaches, to migrants seeking to enter Europe for, as Sally mentioned, whatever the reason may be, betterment, protection, maybe even a mixture of both?
I think absolutely we have a role to play, of course, and I would really echo Bulelani's points around the very different reception we're seeing right now and the importance of Ireland taking this as a moment of reflection and a moment of learning to understand as a state and as a society why the reception and the reaction and the response is so different. I think that's crucial that we do that. What we're seeing, as you say, is this significant movement of refugees within Europe, but it follows on from last year's crisis in Afghanistan, for example, and so many war crises that have produced the same result. As a small nation, we have a long history of migration. And there's a really important role, I believe, in doing exactly as you say, challenging that Western approach to migrants seeking to enter any state. We're also pivotally placed within our roles on the UN Security Council and our EU membership to do that. We also have the upcoming Council of Europe presidency this year. And what we need to do with that is really facilitate the unhampered exodus of people from Ukraine, but also use it as a moment, as I say, to challenge the broader response to refugees from across the globe. I think specifically within the Ukraine crisis, there has to be a focus on disabled people, people currently living in institutions in Ukraine, and those people who, because of ethnicity or race, are facing additional blockages to fleeing Ukraine itself. So I think those are things that we have pointed out as the NHRI. And ultimately, it's absolutely crucial that we take a human rights-based approach to supporting refugees, both in terms of bringing people in and then the integration process. So I would say, for example, and I know we'll probably get into direct provision in a bit more detail later on, but for me, that is a key opportunity. The abolition of direct provision is a really important opportunity for us to reform our international protection system and to become a leader in Europe in how we handle international protection and people fleeing persecution from across the globe. So I think in those kinds of ways, we can think about how we as a state act, we can act as a role model, and we can use our influence in those different ways. I think specifically the provision of accommodation and supports that refugees are taking or are experiencing are crucial. And that has to be something that we look at as a state and how we do obviously better in that. So housing, I think, has to be a really big part of our state response. And then I think really just taking the opportunity to see what is being done in the response to the Ukraine and apply that to refugees from across the globe. The other thing that I would mention as well, and I suppose this is important to us as Ireland's National Rapporteur on Human Trafficking, is really highlighting the difficulties and dangers as regards trafficking at a moment like this. And I think, for example, what we can do is provide clear information in Ukrainian at the moment, and then obviously in all languages with easy access points for people to reach out to. Raising awareness of the rights of refugees on temporary permits, you know, with everything that involves, and then additional inspections to make sure that there isn't labour exploitation. And then again, housing is so important to that, because without appropriate housing, gender-specific housing, and age-specific and trauma-informed responses in terms of housing and the wraparound services that come with that, people can't access those employment rights anyway. And then I think protection against bogus and exploitative assistance offers need to be detected as well. And again, that's something that in our role we'll be looking at. So I think that's how we do it, is we use our geopolitical influence within Europe, but we also as a state build the best system we have to act as that role model for the rest of Europe world.
Jack, coming to like some of the key points that Sinead, Sally and Bulelani all made, the importance of human rights. However, when we look at law, legal regulation, the starting basis of human rights law even is that sovereign states have a right to control who enters, the conditions of entry, time limits in entry. So what role really does human rights have in when kind of the starting basis of human rights is borders are protected?
Thanks, Liam. So obviously borders are very important when considering sovereignty in general, because they basically define where the jurisdiction of a state starts and ends. But similarly with sovereignty, sovereign states are able to bind themselves with international obligations. They're able to voluntarily accept international obligations through, for example, international human rights treaties. And they're also bound by international customary law. So under international customary law, and again, bolstered by the human rights treaties that states themselves sign, there are a number of rights and principles which somewhat limit the unfettered ability of states to decide who enters and who remains within their borders. Among these, I'd mention the principle of non-refoulement, the principle of non-discrimination, the prohibition on collective expulsion, and the principle that states should act in the best interests of the child. So just to give a little bit of information on each of these, Sally rightly pointed out that it's illegal to send someone back to a place where they risk irreparable harm, like a threat to their life or torture or inhuman or degrading treatment. And that's the principle of non-refoulement. So states can't expel someone back to a place where they're likely to suffer from one of these problems. Similarly, the principle of non-discrimination means that you can't pick a certain group and say, all of this group aren't allowed to come into our country, or all of this group have to leave now. For example, on the basis of race or nationality, religion, etc. For collective expulsions, it sounds a very legalistic term, but it's really what's happening with these pushbacks at sea, for example. The principle revolves around the fact that everybody needs to have an individualized assessment of their situation when deciding whether or not someone is able to come into a country. You can't just say, all of these people that are at the border here have to go back, or all of the people within the territory now have to leave. You have to take the individual risk assessment. Are these people likely to be killed when they return? Are these people likely to suffer torture, etc.? And then finally, the best interest of the child also obviously binds states when they're dealing with people under the age of 18. They're bound to come to a decision, not only an individualized decision for the child, but a decision which is going to be in their best interests. As you mentioned, Liam, human rights aren't just for citizens; they're for everyone. They're inalienable. There's no derogation or no exceptions to any of these rights that I've just mentioned, and they apply all the time in areas under a state's jurisdiction or under its control. So there are limits on the ability of states to decide who enters and who remains within their borders.
And those limits, you're probably seeing a mirror image of Sally's book, My Fourth Time We Drowned. Sally, human rights are fairly redundant in terms of, and has been noted in a number of the Q&A in terms of kind of in particular, I think the race issue, that human rights is redundant. It's offensive to say to the tens of thousands of people in Libyan camps that you have those rights, which Jack has expertly outlined as what the law should be, but it's not what is practiced. Any thoughts on that, Sally?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I'm not used to book promotion, but everything is in my book. Please, everybody read it, because this involves hundreds of interviews with people who are going through absolutely like horrific atrocities, and this is being done in our name as Europeans, and I just want everybody to know about that. That's why I wrote it. It's not to promote myself, it's to let people know that. I don't know how much I can say because obviously I could talk forever, but for example, last December, there's two stories I'll tell very quickly. Last December, I met a mother, a woman called Fatima. Her story's in the book. She's now in Gambia. She was living in Libya until her husband became a bit sick, and they tried to cross the sea to reach Europe, basically because he couldn't get healthcare in Libya. Libya is like a not really functional state, and that's partially because of, you know, there has been foreign intervention there that then basically wasn't followed up with state building. And so this whole argument that, you know, Ukraine is more related to Europe than Libya, for example, is actually, first of all, people should know that there has been a lot of our involvement in other countries that needs to be kind of, that leads to a shared history. But then also this woman, Fatima, she tried to cross the sea. She was with her husband and her children. She was locked up in a detention center indefinitely. She then gave birth to her youngest child in detention. Then her eldest son died from appendicitis. He went 3 days. She tried to get him treatment. She was given no treatment. They stayed locked up. He died. Then the husband died around a month later because he then, partly from shock and then also couldn't get medical care. That detention center, people were dying one of every 2 weeks on average, because they were literally locked in a hole with no medical care. And this is people who tried to reach Europe and were locked up because of that. And I met two others. I met Fatima, I mean, in person, and what she's been through is so horrific, and there's been no justice, there's been no reparations. Then I met two other guys who were held in the same detention center. They actually reached Sweden now. They lost, one of them lost 25 kilos in detention, one lost 30 kilos. They were being fed once a day a piece of bread, and they lived there. I think one was there for about a year and one for maybe 2 years. And again, it was a result of trying to reach safety. They came from Eritrea. They come from a country where they would be considered refugees generally if they claimed a right to asylum, if they had that opportunity, which they didn't. So they had escaped a dictatorship. And again, their search to find safety. Now they're in Europe, but they're so traumatized by what they've been through. And yeah, it's really hard to convey in a full sense, but I mean, there are now allegations that there are crimes against humanity going on. UN appointed independent fact-finding mission has now found evidence that there are crimes against humanity happening in a state organized way in Libya against migrants and refugees. And again, like I've said, Europe is playing a very key role in this, and that's what I've been trying to document. I just don't think that people are aware of that. And so all these discussions of Ukraine, of course, it's great that Ukrainian refugees are being welcomed. Of course, what's happening in Ukraine is horrific, but yeah, we need to also know what's been happening on the other borders and the roles that we have been playing in that. And there's a lot of systems have been set up to make sure that we're not hearing those voices, that we're not seeing this problem or seeing what is happening. And that's the way that these systems have been built. And I think that Irish people need to know about this.
That issue about kind of this being a purposeful political decision, do any of our other panelists, do you have any thoughts on that issue, that kind of how politics within Ireland and within the European Union contribute to societal panic, so that to lead to the rights violations which Sally has just outlined? Any of our panelists like to come in on that issue?
Can I come in, Liam? I think it's very evident that migrants tend to be quite a political football. We've seen it in Ireland, we've seen it in Germany, we've seen it in Hungary, we've seen it in Austria, we've seen it across the world, even in my country, in South Africa, where political parties compete for votes by scapegoating people on the move and framing them as a problem. We've seen it happen when people are targeted with violence in South Africa, with xenophobic violence. Just today, there was a report of a Zimbabwean who was chased out of his home, stoned and burned to death for no reason other than being a Zimbabwean in South Africa. And so that politicization of people using people on the move, foreign nationals in their country, as a way to mobilize for votes, is evident throughout the EU and in the US, and now it's propping up in the developing world too. In Turkey, for instance, you're seeing quite a lot of rhetoric against Syrians, and they have taken in quite a number of Syrians. They have millions of refugees in Turkey. But when people politicize people on the move, they tend to make it look like a big problem when it actually isn't. Evidence tells us that 4 out of every 5 people who are displaced are in the developing world. But when you speak to European politicians, when they talk about migrants, they speak as if the entire global south is moving. You've even had statements from people talking about population replacement. You'd swear that we are all moving to Europe, but it's not the case. And we are seeing now European Union accepting the arguments that we've been making to them, that people actually move to their neighbors. They don't go that far. And that's what we are seeing as evidence in Ukraine, that people are moving to their neighbors. They go to Poland and they are accepting that argument. Whereas in the past, both in Ireland and across the EU, they've always argued that people on the move are moving towards your welfare entitlements. For instance, you know, Liam, that it's one of the reasons why direct provision was created in Ireland to deter people from coming here, because they thought that people were coming to claim asylum because they wanted to have access to your wonderful welfare. I don't know who told you have wonderful welfare, but I don't think that's the case. But also in that there is a complete difference with what they preach when they go out to the developing world about human rights, and they tell us about the rule of law and all these wonderful principles that Jack outlined earlier. And when we come here as refugees and asylum seekers, it's very different treatment that we get. That principle of equality before the law, the rule of law, doesn't apply to asylum seekers. We don't have access to judicial review, for instance. So we can't challenge the asylum decisions that we get in the High Court with the support of the Irish state through legal aid, not provided with legal aid for that. We are given less time to prepare an application for judicial review. And so you'd have less than 30 days to prepare that application to challenge a negative decision from the bodies that determine asylum claims in Ireland. And that means that as an asylum seeker who might not be allowed to work, getting 38, 80 a week, you effectively have no access to the courts. You have no legal recourse. So the Irish state can do whatever it pleases with you. And that is appalling for a country that preaches about human rights at international platform. And so that difference is always documented, but we don't see a political will to actually address it. But we're seeing quite a lot of political will now. So hopefully, having exposed all the hypocrisy, we will start now to see change in how the states behave and politicians behave in terms of responding to people on the move.
If I could just compliment Bulelani's point there about the political instrumentalization of migrants. You know, at the moment we're all over the news. We have information about refugees coming from Ukraine, and Poland, one of the countries absolutely leading the charge in accepting them in. 4 months ago, we had information all over the news of Belarusians freezing to death on Poland's border, trying to flee from the instability that was created there since the elections, and Poland wasn't letting them in. And it only takes, you know, one step back to look at and see that this isn't, I mean, first of all, there's no difference between people from Belarus and people from Ukraine, and this isn't a sudden on its head turn of the Polish government in deciding that we're going to become a humanitarian state. This is a political decision to defy Russia. So, and unfortunately, there's how many people caught in the middle of it, you know.
And Sinead, a lot of what Bulelani and Jack's point, which I think is also kind of relevant for Europe, was the amount of submissions I've read, you've written from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, pointing out for 20 years all these violations of human rights. Do you ever get a bit frustrated about what politicians and politics their disengagement, potential disengagement. When they're in opposition, they agree with everything IREC says. When they're in government, not so much. You ever get a bit frustrated about that?
Well, I mean, I'm in post 18 months, so I'm not yet that cynical, Liam, I would hope. But as an organisation, you know, over 7 years as IREC, but obviously over 20 years, including the history of our legacy bodies, these are positions that we have continued to be consistent on. And I mean, like anybody else who works in this sector, you just, change is so slow. And I think it's, personally, I don't get frustrated. I just get more and more intent on working for change. I mean, to pick up on what's just been said, and I think Sally's point is so important. People in Ireland do not know about this. And it's so important that people buy this book and share this message, because I don't believe that there is widespread acceptance or acknowledgement of what the EU policy means on a border level. I mean, our work is, we have a legislative mandate that means that our work is very much domestically focused. So we do not have that the kind of external remit, if you like. What we do is we work through our network bodies of NHRIs and NEBs, that's Equinet and ENRI, to influence as best we can. And I intend to use my position as Chief Commissioner and the access that gives me to, as much as I can, bring this issue to the forefront of our leaders and our politicians and our policymakers. And I've already, you know, I speak obviously with people like Michael O'Flaherty in the Fundamental Rights Agency, and really just try to understand how Ireland can influence this policy, because it is EU policy. And that's the disjoint, is that if the borders, if this was happening on the Irish border rather than the EU border, people would feel it closer to home. They would understand, it would be more visible, it would be more mainstream in our discourse. But because we are a small part of the EU border, it is diluted, if you like, I think, and that general population understanding is so low as a result. So I think that for me is huge. And honestly, I think, I mean, I suppose maybe if I can just move slightly away from official commission position for a minute and just say, I just think theoretically and intellectually as a globe, we need to think about nation states, we need to think about borders. When we have 83 million people at the moment, according to UNHCR figures, that are displaced. Now, I realize that's a lot of internally displaced people, but the figures are just mind-boggling. If that's where we are at as a globe, we have to think about nation states. We have to think about human rights in the context of that. And as Bulelani has pointed out, what that means, if by becoming a displaced person, if by becoming a refugee or an asylum seeker, that you are enjoying a second-class citizenry, you are enjoying less rights than everybody else, then we have to think about what nation states are, what borders are, and how we can look at the whole system. And I think, Liam, universities and academics have a really important part to play in leading that charge. So yes, frustration, absolutely, but I suppose it's not so much frustration as just kind of, it just goes on so long. And when I talk to people in direct provision, for example, it's, you know, things like the white paper and all of these things that just clunk along so slowly, and yet people's lives are anything but slow as they sit in day by day by day in this limbo, with the experience of having no access to the things that the rest of us just take for granted on a daily basis. Those lives and the experience of people is so different than the machinery that takes so long to move anywhere. And I think, you know, I think personally, by speaking and listening to people who are having those lived experiences, that's what keeps me, and I think IREC, motivated to continue to do the work that we do. And I mean, I suppose just to touch on some of the domestic level work that we do, and I suppose have been prominent on in the last while, family reunification is such an important part of this. And that's something that we have been very strong on, and consistently criticising the narrowing of access to family reunification since the International Protection Act in 2015, which really just fails to reflect the lived reality of family ties, networks, relationships, and really was a retrogressive step in terms of what was there before. And I think that's really important. I mean, the specific recommendations that we've made for that is to widen the definition of family members to recognise the diversity of family forms in compliance with international human rights obligations, allow people who've established long-term partnerships or customary marriages to apply for family reunification and ensure that spouses and civil partners are eligible, repeal or amend the 12-month limit for application. And that's the other thing, it's not just the definition, it's the time limits. and clarify in law the rights of programme refugees to reunification, as well as the rights of refugees who acquire Irish citizenship. Because family reunification is so important, just in terms of the safe passage of people, because it goes beyond what we've heard, Sally's experience. It becomes then a legal method for people to access refuge and protection. But it then assists with so many of the other difficulties that people experience. I was speaking at the Akidra strategy launch on Tuesday, and the experience of migrant women, which is so much harder because they do not have that network of people around them. They don't have the same childcare supports that others would have to allow them to enter work and engage and participate fully in society. So when people are joined by their family and their network, that changes and it transforms people's experience in their host country. So I think those are some of the ways. And then racism is the other area which I think we would see as a really vital place where IREC as a body has work to do, and it's something that continues to be a priority for us. But it is also the case that we have been very clear that this is the state's responsibility to actively combat racism. And obviously we're about to see the National Action Plan against racism, which is so important, but that has to be resourced, it has to be sponsored effectively so that people are held to account, and we have a massive submission. I won't go into detail on that. Sorry, I'll stop there, Liam.
Thanks so much, Sinead. And you know what, I think you do provide a response that it is about that continuous engagement, even when things seem impossible to change, because direct provision and now the proposal to end direct provision, just a few short months before that, before the kind of publication on the white paper to end direct provision, you did have kind of ministers in the previous government saying, give us solutions, tell us how to deal with this. And the white paper offers at least one solution, may not be absolutely perfect. And Bulelani, you're a doctoral researcher, you're an expert on direct provision, but you're also an expert by lived experience in direct provision. Do you think the white paper on the system of direct provision will result in greater respect for and protection of persons' human rights?
I think that remains to be seen, Liam, because if in the white paper itself they are refusing to provide support for people to live independently in the community. So for instance, the people who will be receiving support from the Irish state will have to be living in reception centers. You can call them whatever you want to call them. They're still direct provision centers by whatever name you want to call them. So if in order to get support from the Irish state to live your life in Ireland, you have to go and live in that center, that's still direct provision by a different name. So confining and limiting people only to the supports that is provided through those reception centers becomes unbearable for people who live in those centers for too long. We would know that direct provision was meant to be a temporary. People weren't meant to be living in direct provision for a very long time, but we ended up in having people living in direct provision for longer than 10 years, precisely because the state does not invest adequate resources in the processing of asylum claims. We are seeing now delays in issuing very simple things like the temporary residency card that recognizes a person as an asylum seeker, and that card entitles a person to access other public services, such as going to school, children going to school, accessing medical care, accessing the weekly allowance, pathetic weekly allowance of 38.80 euro. I spoke to a woman who arrived in Ireland in November, just this week, and her child has still not been in school. Arrived in Ireland in November and still not in school today. That's a clear breach of EU reception conditions directive for asylum seekers, because they are required to ensure that the child has access to a school no longer than 90 days. It's explicit in providing for access to education, but we have here a state that is actually in violation of that. And it becomes very difficult, as I said earlier, for a person in that position who has no income to actually challenge the state's breaches. And so what we are seeing now in the state is that they've demonstrated that they can issue a documentation very fast. They've opened into your centers, for instance, to issue PPS numbers for Ukrainians at weekends. So it is possible to get all these things done timely if the state chooses to do so. But what we're asking is that they should do so for everybody else and not just do it for one particular group in the country, because everybody else in the country has entitlement. Every child in the state, we believe, has an entitlement to education and should be assisted by the state to access that education. It is appalling that we are not seeing that happening. And so when you still maintain in the white paper rules that that you have to go and stay in a reception center, you won't be provided with support if you don't live in that reception. It tells us that the direct provision system will be simply amended rather than abolished. We will have it by a different name. They are reluctant to provide support for people to go and live independently in the community without going through those supports. They are also maintaining the restrictions on access to the labor market. The Catherine Day group, as you would know, Liam, are called on less restrictive measures, such as giving people access to work within 3 months from arrival, and the state refused to do that. They also called on them to change the type of work permit that asylum seekers, I think Sinead can touch on that, because employers in Ireland will treat people differently because they didn't understand how the permit works, and the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission had to have a campaign, a whole campaign, in order to educate Irish employers on how to go about employing an asylum seeker because of the different type of a work permit that asylum seekers are given. The Catherine Day Advisory Group called on the government to change that type, to bring it in line with other non-EU nationals who are living in the state, because all employers in Ireland would know what a work permit a non-EU national is to have, but the Irish government has refused to do that. So when you still maintain those restrictions on the right to work and giving people independence and personal autonomy to shape major and minor aspects of their everyday life, it doesn't give us much confidence that you will enter, especially now, seeing that the state is talking about having tanks for Ukrainians in a few months. If we're still seeing a large number of people coming in, it's difficult to see how they are going to end the system of direct provision when there is not a concerted effort to invest in building social housing.
So, for some key kind of themes that we've engaged with today, a key issue was that of race and ethnicity, and how race and ethnicity can inform states in seeking to justify differentiation. The role of human rights, even where human rights are violated, that they still can act as an important tool to hold states to account by reminding states of their freely accepted obligations. And then looking at journeys and just how journeys differ, linking in with what Sally and also Sinead mentioned, how journeys differ just because of your passport or lack thereof, or your country of citizenship. Can I ask you all to just give us 1 minute, try to give us something. Is there anything you either want people on this webinar to do, or anything that you feel people could positively contribute to change these injustices that we have discussed over the last 50 minutes or so? Sally?
I mean, for me, yeah, thank you so much again for UCD as well for hosting this. For me, I'm a journalist. I mean, it's not particularly my role to offer the solutions, but I can tell you once again that I wrote a book. You can read all the information in it. It's taken me about 4 years, or depending on when you count from, even like 5, 6, 7 years of reporting. And one thing that I can say as a journalist, I mean, this information is hard won. You know, it can seem, and I hear this, once I start saying it, people are like, oh, I've heard this before, or maybe we already knew this, but that's not true. Like for me, I've been reporting this, I've faced death threats, I've been under criminal investigation, and I've put together this information, and I honestly don't think that the Irish people understand that they are complicit in what is happening currently in the Mediterranean and on Europe's borders. And I really think everybody needs to know about this. I mean, this is men, women, and children being locked up for trying to seek safety. This isn't the refugee system you would imagine. This is really, really like horrific. And that's all I can say. I think the first step to changing anything is being informed. And yeah, I just hope that people will inform themselves, not just my book, like other ways as well. You know, you can look for other sources, but yeah, I mean, we're trying our hardest to share this information, a lot of us, and I really hope that people will start to pay attention. We just don't want them to look away anymore.
And one of our attendees, Sarah, has just actually noted when she asked a neighbour or was discussing issues with neighbour, and the neighbour says, what is direct provision? That at times it's just that knowledge gap. Jack, do you have anything to add on hope, on solutions, on knowledge in terms of migrant journeys?
So I guess speaking from my side as working with the UN Human Rights Office at the moment, like we produce a huge amount of monitoring and reporting. We do a lot of analysis of human rights, how they should be applied in practice and things. And as Sally said, you know, the first step is being informed. But I've always seen, because my background has been working with, you know, civil society, I've always seen that it needs to be like a ground up effort is the strongest way to create change. The kind of ground up effort that Bulelani is involved in, for example. There are so many UN mechanisms that are producing information on, let's take Ireland, for example. So Ireland last year was reviewed in the Universal Periodic Review. That's a review that takes place of every UN state every 5 years. And during that review, Ireland accepted recommendations to end direct provision. It accepted recommendations to afford more legal assistance to migrants and refugees, the same way that Bulelani was talking about. And it accepted to reduce xenophobia and racism. Similarly, the Committee on the Rights of the Child have given recommendations on migrants and refugees. The Committee Against Torture, the Human Rights Committee, all of these within the last 8 years. And you know, if on one side journalism can be using this information to highlight the failures of governments in upholding their human rights obligations, and civil society can be doing it, then we can have an informed public with a critical mass that will be able to affect change, you know.
Bulelani, do you have any, and you have 1 minute, as my alarm is telling me we need to finish up?
I think the very positive changes that are happening in Ireland, I think we've seen the minister announcing that they will be regularizing undocumented people who have been in the country for at least 4 years, but also people who have been stuck in the asylum process for at least 2 years will also regularize their status and begin a pathway to Irish citizenship. I think demonstrating that demonstrates to us that it is actually possible to treat people more humanely, to recognize that you have failed as a state to give people access to justice very quick, promptly, is a very good start. But there is more that can be done to ensure that all people in Irish state have access to public services unimpeded and not discriminated on the basis of where they come from. As we are currently seeing, I think there is a strong potential to get things done if we depart from the premise that all our lives are precious and worth to be cherished. I think if we start from there, we can move forward very quickly. But again, I want to emphasize that Irish politicians didn't wake up in 2020 because of the goodness of their heart and compassion and committed in the program for government to end direct provision or to regularize undocumented people. They did so because undocumented people and asylum seekers have been campaigning for years and speaking to Irish people. And Irish people, in fact, we asked Irish people to send emails to their politicians in 2020 calling for an end to direct poverty and to regularization of undocumented people. And thousands of people turned up and sent those emails to their TDs, and we saw the change that can happen when people are mobilized to get things done. And so I think we can put pressure on our politicians. They are there for a reason. We elect them because we believe they can make laws by which we all must live. And they can make more humane laws if we get them to do so. If we make them.
Fine. Thank you, Bulelani. And Sinead, last word.
Oh, thank you. I mean, certainly would echo everything that Sally, Jack and Bulelani have spoken about in terms of how we can seek solutions and move forward. And I, once again, just to reiterate, though, I really do think it's a hard narrative or a hard line to add to the narrative or the dialogue at the moment around, obviously, it's such a positive thing that we're seeing in relation to the response to the Ukraine crisis. And it's not to diminish that, it's to celebrate it and then ask as a country why we aren't so receptive and why we don't have the same response when people have a different ethnicity or a different skin color or they're coming from a different part of the globe. It's just crucial that as a state and as a society we do that. I think reading Sally's book is a really good start to understand the crisis in the Mediterranean. And I think the other book I would recommend immediately, I was just trying to reach for it there, is Emma Dabiri's book, What White People Can Do Next. But also in terms of racism on an individual level, we all of those of us who do not have lived experience of racism or racial discrimination must listen to the experience of those who do. And that is people of different ethnicities, it's migrants, it's travelers, and really, and Romas, and really understand the experience. And if you don't have people in your lives who have that lived experience, find them, employ people from the international protection system, make connections with your local traveller groups, and really start to understand that we are a diverse society in Ireland. We have to, as individuals, act on that and be proactive in combating racism on an individual and a state level.
Sinead Gibney, Sally Hayden, Bulelani Mfaco and Jack Pope, thank you very much. I'm Liam Thornton and I hope you enjoyed today's discussion. It was a difficult discussion, but I think in the panelists' closing contributions, we may need to educate ourselves. We also may need to be more engaged than maybe we've previously been. What small steps can we all maybe think of to take those small conversations that begin, be it at home, in the workplace? That might be the best place to start in hoping that we achieve a society and a European Union that respects, protects, promotes, and fulfills human rights. I'm 2 minutes over. Huge apologies, Lola Cullen. Lola, over to you.
Thanks, Liam. That was a really powerful conversation. So a huge thanks to our inspiring guests, Sinead, Sally, Bulelani and Jack, for such an informative and enlightening discussion. And Liam, thank you for facilitating and guiding us through this conversation with our incredible panel. I'm just sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but it's obviously very clear we'll definitely need to revisit this area again for future events. So yeah, with that, thank you to the audience for tuning in. A recording of the event will be available tomorrow on our YouTube channel. And just before I wrap up, I'd like to let you know about our next virtual event taking place on the 13th of April at 1 p.m. as part of our What It Takes career building series. It will discuss what it takes to be an inclusive leader, and the link is in the chat box if anyone would like to register. So thank you again to our excellent speakers and to everyone for joining us. We look forward to welcoming you at our next webinar. Have a great day. Thank you.